January 17, 1944, somewhere over the frost-bound fields of northern France, 21,000 feet above a world at war. The sky that morning was the colour of old steel, grey, cold, infinite. Inside the cramped fuselage of a B-24 Liberator, Technical Sergeant Michael Harrington could see his breath crystallizing in the thin air. The oxygen mask pressed tight against his face, each inhalation a rasping effort against the altitude. Through the small porthole window, the earth below seemed almost peaceful, a patchwork of snow-dusted farmland, tiny villages, and narrow roads threading through the frozen landscape like veins of black ice. But Harrington knew better. Somewhere down there, or perhaps already climbing toward them through the cloud layers, German interceptors were scrambling. Messerschmitt Bf-109S, Focke-Wulf 190S. Hunters rising to meet the bombers in their daily ritual of violence and machinery. The B-24 shuddered as it encountered a pocket of turbulence. Harrington steadied himself against the cold metal bulkhead, feeling the vibration of 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines thrumming through his bones. 1,400 horsepower per engine, 5,600 horses pulling this 32-ton beast through hostile sky. The bomber smelled of hydraulic fluid, sweat, gun oil, and fear, a scent that had become as familiar to him as his mother's kitchen back in Ohio. But there was something else in the air that morning, something the German pilots climbing toward them could not yet comprehend. It was the scent of American industrial might, of assembly lines that never stopped, of a nation that had transformed itself into an arsenal of democracy, and it would manifest itself in a way that would shatter every assumption the Luftwaffe had carefully cultivated about heavy bombers. For 3 years, German fighter pilots had operated under a comfortable doctrine. Heavy bombers were slow, heavy bombers were vulnerable, heavy bombers were targets. Flying fortresses, perhaps, but ultimately predictable, ultimately catchable. The mathematics of interception had been calculated, practiced, perfected. A Bf-109G could reach speeds of 386 miles per hour. The standard engagement profile was straightforward: climb to altitude, position for attack, close the distance, fire, break away. American B-17 flying fortresses cruised at roughly 182 miles per hour. Even the newer models barely exceeded 287 miles per hour at altitude. The speed differential gave German pilots all the time they needed to line up their attacks, to choose their angles, to press home their assault with methodical precision. But the consolidated B-24 Liberator was not a flying fortress. And on this frozen morning, in January 1944, dozens of Luftwaffe pilots were about to discover a truth that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the air war over Europe. The origins of this revelation stretched back to 1939, to the drawing boards of Consolidated Aircraft Corporation in San Diego, where engineers had been given an audacious mandate: design a heavy bomber that could fly farther, carry more, and fly faster than anything currently in service. The result was an aircraft that looked nothing like the elegant, traditional lines of the B-17. Where the Flying Fortress had a circular fuselage and graceful curves, the B-24 was angular, utilitarian, almost brutish in its efficiency. Its most distinctive feature was the Davis wing, a high aspect ratio wing design that sacrificed structural simplicity for extraordinary aerodynamic efficiency. It was this wing, thin and long and scientifically optimized, that gave the Liberator capabilities its enemies consistently underestimated. The German pilots, climbing through the morning cloud layer that January day, had studied their intelligence briefings. They knew the Americans were flying deeper into the Reich with each passing month. They knew the bomber streams were growing larger, more organized, more dangerous. But intelligence photographs showed lumbering 4-engine behemoths, and captured documents spoke of heavily laden aircraft struggling under the weight of bombs and ammunition. What the intelligence reports failed to capture, what could not be adequately conveyed through reconnaissance photographs or prisoner interrogations, was the raw performance envelope that American engineering had achieved. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber had been flying combat missions since 1941. He had fought over Britain during the later stages of the Blitz, had escorted Stukas over the Eastern Front, had defended German airspace against the growing tide of Allied bombers. His Focke-Wulf 100 carried the scars of 24 engagements, patches on the fuselage where 0.5 caliber rounds had punched through aluminium. A replaced canopy after a too-close pass had showered him with perspex fragments, victory markings along the nose that numbered 17. 17 bombers destroyed. 17 funeral pyres tumbling from the sky, trailing black smoke and screaming men. On this morning, Weber and his Staffel were vectored toward a formation of B-24S that had been detected by coastal radar, heading inland toward targets in the industrial Ruhr Valley. The interception should have been textbook. The bombers were flying at 21,000 feet, high enough to challenge the F-1090's performance, but well within its operational ceiling. Weber's squadron had altitude advantage, positioning themselves at 24,000 feet, slightly ahead of the bomber stream's projected path. The plan was simple: dive down through the formation, attack from the front quarter where the bomber's defensive armament was weakest, then use superior speed to break away before the defensive gunners could track effectively. Weber had executed this maneuver successfully on 11 previous occasions. He had no reason to believe this morning would be different. But as he pushed his fighter's nose down and began his attack run, building speed in the dive, something immediately felt wrong. The B-24S were not maintaining the slow, steady course he expected. They were moving, truly moving, across the sky with a speed that seemed impossible for aircraft of their size and weight. Weber had closed to within 800 meters when he realized his angle of attack was deteriorating. The bombers were not where they should be. He adjusted, banking slightly to compensate, but the correction came with a cost in airspeed. His F-190 was fast, perhaps 395 miles per hour in this dive, but now he was watching the bombers with a growing sense of disbelief. They were not running. They were not taking evasive action. They were simply maintaining their course and altitude, and yet they seemed to be pulling away from him. The first burst from his 20 ME cannons fell behind the trailing bomber. Impossible. Weber had calculated the deflection perfectly based on 3 years of combat experience. But his training had been based on B-17S, on Stirlings, on bombers that flew at predictable speeds. The B-24 Liberators in his sights were cruising at 290 miles per hour, not their maximum speed, simply their efficient cruise speed at altitude. For a heavy bomber carrying a full combat load of bombs, fuel, ammunition and crew, this was a performance that challenged every assumption German fighter doctrine had been built upon. Weber's wingman, Lieutenant Hans Krebs, experienced the same confounding reality. Years later, in a prisoner-of-war interview conducted after the war, Krebs would describe that morning with a mixture of professional respect and lingering frustration. "We closed on them expecting the usual engagement," he recalled. "We had made these attacks hundreds of times, but these bombers, these Liberators, they simply kept moving. Not evasive maneuvers, you understand, just straight and level flight, but at a speed that made our attack profiles completely wrong. By the time you corrected your aim, adjusted for their actual speed rather than what you expected, you had already lost the optimal firing position. And if you tried to pursue for a second pass, you found yourself fighting to catch them in level flight." The tactical implications were devastating. German fighters attacking B-24 formations found themselves with drastically reduced time on target. The closing speed during an attack run was less favorable, giving bomber gunners more time to track and engage. Breaking away after an attack required more distance and energy, exposing the fighters to defensive fire for longer periods. And most frustrating of all, damaged fighters that had expended their energy in attack runs often found themselves unable to catch the bomber stream for a second pass. The B-24S simply cruised away while the fighters, lower and slower after their attacks, struggled to regain the altitude and speed necessary for another engagement. This was not a single instance, not an anomaly or exceptional circumstance. Throughout the winter and spring of 1944, as American bomber operations intensified over occupied Europe and Germany itself, Luftwaffe pilots encountered this same bewildering reality repeatedly. Major Heinz Bahr, a German ace with 220 victories, noted in his diary that engaging B-24 formations required fundamentally different tactics than attacks on B-17S or British bombers. "The Liberator gives you one good pass, perhaps two if conditions are perfect," he wrote. "After that you are chasing them, and a fighter chasing a bomber formation is a fighter wasting fuel and exposing itself to escort fighters." The root of German shock lay not in a single technical specification, but in the cumulative effect of American design philosophy. Where European aviation had evolved through decades of incremental improvements and resource constraints, American aircraft design, in the 1940s, was unshackled by tradition or scarcity. The Davis wing on the B-24 was a perfect example. It was aerodynamically brilliant but structurally challenging, requiring advanced manufacturing techniques and materials that would have been prohibitively expensive or simply unavailable to European manufacturers operating under wartime economies. The Pratt & Whitney engines were similarly ambitious. Not the most powerful engines available, but meticulously optimized for high-altitude performance and reliability. The result was an aircraft that could cruise at 215 mph at sea level, but achieve 290 mph at 25,000 feet, where the thin air and careful aerodynamic design allowed the Liberator to reach performance levels that seemed impossible for an aircraft weighing 32 tons fully loaded. German intelligence struggled to reconcile the reports coming from their pilots. Initial assessments dismissed the speed claims as exaggerations, the natural tendency of combat veterans to inflate the capabilities of their opponents to explain failed interceptions. But as more encounter reports accumulated, as more gun camera footage was analyzed, as more pilots independently reported the same phenomenon, the Luftwaffe was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. American heavy bombers were no longer the slow, vulnerable targets they had once been. The industrial capacity that allowed the United States to produce B-24 Liberators in greater numbers than any other American aircraft, 18,482 units by war's end, was the same industrial capacity that allowed for sophisticated engineering, for powerful engines, for the kind of performance optimization that European manufacturers could only dream of, while their factories were being bombed and their resources diverted to emergency production runs. For the German pilots, this revelation arrived with a psychological weight that transcended mere tactics. They had entered the war confident in their training, their aircraft and their doctrine. The Luftwaffe of 1940 had swept aside opposition with methodical efficiency. Their fighters were superior, their tactics were proven, their victories were inevitable. By 1944, that confidence had eroded under the relentless pressure of a two-front air war, but the fundamental assumptions remained. Fighters were fast, bombers were slow, and proper tactics would always prevail. The B-24 Liberator challenged that final assumption. It forced German pilots to confront the reality that their opponents were not just numerous, but qualitatively superior in ways that negated traditional advantages. Oberleutnant Josef Zwernemann, who would survive the war with 32 confirmed victories, described the psychological impact in post-war interviews. When you cannot catch the enemy, when your aircraft strains at full throttle and still they pull away, you begin to question everything. Not just your tactics or your aircraft, but the entire premise of the war. How do you win when the enemy can outproduce you 10-1 and their bombers fly faster than your doctrine says bombers should fly? Every mission became a reminder that we were not fighting an enemy we could defeat through skill or courage alone. We were fighting an industrial system, an economic machine that could afford to make their bombers faster, their fighters longer ranged, their bombs heavier, and we could not compete with that. The recurring symbol of American capability witnessed by German pilots in those desperate encounters was not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but a simple, undeniable fact. The bombers kept coming. Day after day, mission after mission, the four-engine formations appeared on the horizon. Some were B-17s, yes, but increasingly they were B-24 Liberators, flying in tight defensive boxes, maintaining speeds that made interception difficult, and sustaining attacks nearly impossible. And when German fighters did manage to down one of these bombers, when cannon shells finally found fuel tanks or oxygen systems, when a Liberator's wing folded or its fuselage broke apart, the formation simply closed ranks and continued on. The next day there would be more, always more. The mathematics were inescapable. Germany produced approximately 35,000 Messerschmitt Bf-109s during the entire war. The United States produced more B-24 Liberators than that, a single bomber type, not counting B-17s, B-25s, B-29s, and every other aircraft rolling off American assembly lines. The technical specifications told only part of the story. Yes, the B-24D could reach 303 mph at 25,000 feet when pushed, making it genuinely fast for a heavy bomber. Yes, its range of 2,100 miles allowed it to strike targets deep in occupied Europe and return to bases in England. Yes, its bomb load of 8,000 pounds meant each aircraft represented significant destructive potential, but the deeper truth, the truth that dawned on German fighter pilots with the weight of inevitability, was that these specifications represented American industrial philosophy made manifest. The B-24 was not designed to be the best possible aircraft. It was designed to be an excellent aircraft that could be mass-produced efficiently, maintained by moderately trained ground crews, and flown by pilots with relatively brief training periods. It was democracy's answer to totalitarianism, not the perfect weapon, but the good enough weapon, produced in unstoppable quantities. The winter of 1944 gave way to spring, and the air war over Europe intensified. Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, saw the 8th Air Force launch massive coordinated strikes against German aircraft production facilities. On February 20, 1944, over 1,000 American bombers attacked targets across Germany. B-24 Liberator groups flew 499 sorties during that single day, nearly half the total bomber force. German fighters rose to meet them, and the sky over Central Europe became a chaotic arena of contrails, tracer fire, and falling aircraft. The Luftwaffe claimed significant victories, but the cost was catastrophic. German fighter losses during Big Week exceeded 355 aircraft, with experienced pilots killed at a rate that could not be replaced. And among the after-action reports, among the debriefings and combat assessments, a common theme emerged. Liberator formations were difficult to intercept, difficult to attack effectively, and nearly impossible to pursue if the initial attack failed. By summer, the Normandy invasion had fundamentally altered the strategic situation. American bombers now flew with escort fighters that could accompany them all the way to their targets. P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks, P-47 Thunderbolts with extended range, P-38 Lightnings that could match any German fighter in performance. The B-24 Liberators pressed deeper into the Reich, striking oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants, marshalling yards, and industrial complexes. Their speed, once their secret advantage, became simply one more element in an overwhelming system of aerial dominance. German pilots, who had once hunted bombers with confidence, now found themselves hunted, forced to fight through screens of escort fighters just for the chance to make a single pass at the bomber stream before retreating. The shock German crews experienced was not a moment but a process, a gradual, grinding realization that accumulated with each mission, each failed interception, each engagement where the bombers simply outran damaged or low-fuel fighters. It was the shock of facing an opponent who could afford to design bombers for performance rather than merely for payload. It was the shock of confronting an industrial system so vast that it could optimize and mass-produce sophisticated aircraft while simultaneously supplying armies on multiple continents. It was the shock of understanding, perhaps for the first time with true clarity, that Germany had gone to war against a nation that operated under completely different economic and industrial rules. In the cockpit of a B-24 Liberator, the crew experienced none of this existential doubt. They faced flak, fighters, mechanical failures, and weather. They endured fear and exhaustion, and the particular terror of being trapped in an aluminium tube while explosive shells tore through it. But they did not doubt their aircraft. The Liberator was uncomfortable, drafty, difficult to fly in formation, and prone to catching fire if struck in the wrong place, yet it was also fast, capable, and reliable. It brought them to the target, and more often than not, it brought them home. Technical Sergeant Michael Harrington, who had watched the frozen landscape of France pass beneath him that January morning, would fly 32 missions in B-24s. His bomber, bearing the cheerfully inappropriate name Pregnant Petunia, would take flak damage on 7 occasions, lose 2 engines simultaneously over Munich, and limp home on 3 engines after a fighter attack over Schweinfurt. She never failed to bring her crew home, and she never let a German fighter catch her when she wanted to run. The symbolic weight of the B-24's speed extended beyond mere tactical advantage. It represented a fundamental asymmetry in how the two sides approached aerial warfare. German aircraft design, brilliant and innovative in many ways, was constrained by resource scarcity and the demands of a multi-front war. The Luftwaffe needed fighters that could be produced quickly with limited materials, that could be maintained by depleted ground crews, that could operate from damaged airfields with minimal support infrastructure. The result was aircraft that prioritized certain capabilities, climb rate, maneuverability, firepower, while accepting limitations in range, reliability, and operational flexibility. American aircraft design, by contrast, operated in an environment of relative abundance. The United States could afford to develop specialized aircraft for specific roles. It could afford to prioritize crew comfort and survivability. It could afford to design a bomber with an exotic high-efficiency wing that required advanced manufacturing techniques because those techniques were available and the industrial capacity existed to implement them at scale. The B-24 Liberator was not perfect. Pilots complained about its handling characteristics, gunners found the ball turret claustrophobic, engineers worried about its structural weakness compared to the B-17, but it was effective, and it was produced in numbers that made individual imperfections irrelevant. As the war ground toward its conclusion, as German cities were reduced to rubble and the Luftwaffe's fuel supplies evaporated, the psychological impact of those early encounters with B-24 formations echoed through the German fighter arm. Veterans who survived the war spoke of a creeping sense of futility, a recognition that courage and skill were insufficient against an enemy whose resources seemed limitless. The fast American bombers became a symbol of that disparity, a visible, undeniable manifestation of industrial might that could not be shot down, could not be outmaneuvered, could only be endured until fuel ran low or ammunition was exhausted, or the inevitable moment when a P-51 appeared in the rearview mirror. The epilogue to this story is written in production numbers and mission logs, in the thousands of sorties flown by B-24 groups across every theatre of the war. From England, Liberators struck at the heart of Nazi Germany. From Italy, they targeted oil fields in Romania and industrial targets in Austria. From the Pacific Islands, they hammered Japanese positions across enormous distances. The B-24 flew more missions, dropped more bombs, and traveled more miles than any other American aircraft of World War II. Its speed, that shocking, doctrine-shattering speed, was just one element of its success. But it was an element that revealed a deeper truth about the nature of total war in the industrial age. The German pilots who climbed into their fighters each morning, who pushed throttles forward and rose to meet the bomber streams, were brave men fighting for a cause they believed in. But bravery alone cannot overcome the arithmetic of industrial production. Skill alone cannot compensate for fundamental resource disparities, and doctrine, no matter how well proven or brilliantly conceived, becomes obsolete when the enemy's aircraft perform in ways that doctrine says should be impossible. In the end, the B-24 Liberator's greatest victory was not any single mission or target destroyed. It was the cumulative psychological weight it placed on an enemy who had expected easy victories, and found instead an opponent whose bombers could outrun their interceptors, whose production lines could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted, whose pilots kept coming back day after day with the mechanical persistence of men who knew with absolute certainty that they were backed by a nation that had transformed itself into an engine of victory. That certainty, that unshakable confidence born from industrial abundance, was more devastating to German morale than any bomb tonnage could be. The frost-bound fields of northern France eventually thawed. Spring came, then summer, then victory. The B-24 Liberators that had shocked German pilots with their speed eventually returned to American soil, where most were scrapped or sold for salvage. They were not beautiful aircraft. They were not beloved by their crews in the way the B-17 was, but they were effective. They were fast, and they represented, in their angular utilitarian design, the triumph of American industrial democracy over fascist militarism. Not through individual superiority, but through the overwhelming application of organized production and engineering excellence. The sky remembers nothing. The contrails fade. The men who flew and fought are nearly all gone now. But the lesson remains, carved into the historical record through mission reports and combat diaries and the stunned testimony of German pilots who discovered at 21,000 feet over frozen farmland that the heavy bombers they had trained to hunt could simply fly away from them, engines droning steadily, course unaltered, destination inevitable. In that moment of realization, repeated across thousands of encounters over 2 years of brutal aerial combat, the outcome of the air war over Europe was decided not by tactics or courage, but by the simple, crushing mathematics of American abundance made manifest in aluminium, engines, and speed.